The chapel attached to the sacred Solstice Union Cathedral was cold. It was not the brisk chill of a passing winter morning, but the deep freezing of northern stone that had not absorbed true sunlight in centuries. Nellie Vance stood perfectly still before a tall, tarnished mirror, her reflection framed by the grey light bleeding through the high clerestory windows. Her fingers, steady and pale, moved with deliberate precision as she smoothed the edges of the silver-threaded veil draped across her shoulders. The fabric was heavy, weighted with actual spun metal, meant to represent the enduring wealth of the regional lordship. In the dim, tallow-lit alcove, it felt remarkably like a shroud. Beyond the thick oak door separating the dressing chamber from the grand hall, the low murmur of arriving high society guests vibrated against the floorboards. Hundreds of voices layered together, echoing off the vaulted ceilings like the distant sound of a rising tide. It was the sound of the pack elite gathering to witness a contractual transfer of power. Nellie did not close her eyes to block out the noise. She did not allow her breathing to shorten. Instead, she treated the final moments of her preparation like a strict administrative audit. A thick pillar candle burned on the iron stand to her left, its beeswax melted in slow, precise intervals, gathering at the rim before slipping down the side. A drop fell, hitting the iron base with a quiet hiss. She counted her own pulse against that falling wax. 1 beat, 2. Another drop pooled and fell. Her heart maintained a perfectly even rhythm. There was no flush of bridal anticipation rushing to her cheeks. There was no nervous tension tightening her jaw. She documented her own physiological calm, the way she verified a column of numbers in the territorial ledgers. The cold drafted upward through the thin soles of her slippers, but she ignored the discomfort, focusing entirely on maintaining her posture. Shoulders pulled back, spine straight. Chin held parallel to the freezing floor. Her place today was to execute a rigid legal requirement, standing as the designated firstborn bride to secure the estate's ancestral lease. It was a transaction of bloodlines and territory, stripped of romantic illusion. She noted the slight abrasive drag of the metallic threads against her collarbone, a tactile reminder of the heavy obligations she was about to step into. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most but lighter to carry. The heavy iron latch of the dressing room door lifted with a sharp clack, instantly breaking the arithmetic of the dripping wax. The air pressure in the small stone room shifted, carrying the cloying scent of crushed jasmine. Vivienne Sterling did not merely walk into a room, she arranged herself within it. The sister stepped over the threshold, pulling the door shut behind her. Her expression was fixed into a mask of perfect sympathy. Nellie did not look at the smile. She looked at the fabric. Vivienne was wearing a gown entirely unsuited for a supporting witness. It was layered with deep violet velvet that caught the candlelight in aggressive flashes. It was the dress of a woman signaling her own status to the cathedral outside. The rich perfume she wore overpowered the clean smell of pine oil and coal dust that had settled in the alcove. It was a sensory invasion, a quiet assertion of dominance designed to shrink the space around the bride. "You look so terribly pale," Vivienne murmured, her voice coated in a manufactured sweetness. The older woman closed the distance between them, raising a hand adorned with heavy sapphire rings. She reached out, her fingers extending to adjust the delicate edge of the veil resting on her sister's collarbone. It was a classic territorial maneuver, a touch disguised as care, meant to force the recipient to accept being physically handled. Nellie did not flinch. She did not raise a hand to block the gesture. Instead, she executed a flawless, imperceptible shift of her weight from her heels to the balls of her feet. She stepped back exactly 3 inches. It was a calculated retreat, placing her just beyond the physical radius of Vivienne's fingertips. The other woman's hand hung suspended in the empty freezing air, grasping nothing but the draft. Refusing to lower her gaze, the bride maintained a polite, entirely neutral stare. She locked her eyes onto the bridge of her sister's nose, rather than meeting her pupils directly. It was a tactical technique used when dealing with hostile merchants disputing a ledger entry, stripping the interaction of emotional intimacy while projecting absolute focus. "The lighting in this alcove is poor," Nellie replied. Her tone was perfectly flat, delivering the statement as a mere observation of the architecture. Vivienne's smile tightened. The muscles around her jaw strained as she slowly let her hand drop. The heavy silk of her sleeves rustled sharply, the sound aggressive in the quiet room. She had come to rattle a nervous bride, to establish a quiet hierarchy before the grand procession began. But there was nothing to rattle. Her target offered no nervous energy, no defensive anger, no vulnerable opening. The murmurs from the great hall swelled briefly as the outer doors opened and closed in the distance, a signal that the final guests had taken their seats. Vivienne smoothed the front of her own elaborate velvet dress, her knuckles whitening against the dark fabric. "Cassian is waiting," she said, letting the name roll off her tongue with a practiced, proprietary weight. Nellie merely blinked. She turned back to the tarnished mirror, adjusting one final, microscopic fold of the heavy lace, her pulse remaining perfectly steady against the cold stone walls. The heavy oak doors of the sacred Solstice Union Cathedral groaned as they were pulled open, ushering in a draught of bitter northern wind that instantly smothered the warmth of the tallow candles. The grand procession was meant to begin with a choral chant, but today the vaulted space felt far too hollow for celebration. It felt exactly like what it truly was, a sterile transfer of land tenure clauses, draped in the fragile pretense of a mating ceremony. Nellie stood near the nave, allowing the freezing temperature of the flagstones to radiate straight through the thin soles of her shoes. The cold kept her mind sharp, anchoring her to the physical reality of the room. The silver-threaded veil rested heavily against her collarbones, catching the weak light filtering through the clerestory windows. Woven with real silver wire, it was designed not to enhance a bride's beauty, but to demonstrate financial solvency. She did not fidget under its stifling weight, merely standing with her hands clasped lightly, watching the altar where the architecture of her future was being laid out. Brandon Thorne stood behind the block of polished marble, his movements devoid of sentiment. The pack elder did not arrange winter flowers or light ceremonial incense. Instead, he aligned heavy, leather-bound ledger books across the stone, squaring their brass-capped corners with the meticulous precision of an auditor. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light, disturbed by the dry sound of ancient parchment. Elder Thorne picked up the thick union ribbons, testing their tension between his ink-stained knuckles before laying them flat beside the registry. When he finally looked up, his pale gaze found Nellie in the shadows. He offered a single, rigid nod. It was not a gesture of warmth or the welcoming smile of an elder receiving a new daughter. It was the curt, administrative acknowledgement of a signature line on a contract. He was looking at the physical embodiment of an ancient alliance, a necessary variable in the preservation of territorial stability rather than a living bride. Nellie breathed in the specific scent of the space. There were no blooming roses here, no sweet pine resins to mask the tension. The air smelled only of dry, curing ink, old vellum, and the damp chill of a harsh winter. This was a courtroom masquerading as a chapel. Every high-ranking guest seated in the carved pews was simply a witness to a legal transaction. She kept her posture perfectly straight, matching the elder's procedural detachment with her own measured stillness. She belonged to the ledgers now, bound by silver threads that felt more like chains of office than any promise of devotion. The steady rhythm of leather bootsteps echoed from the rear of the cathedral, cutting sharply through the low murmurs of the assembled elites. Cassian Garrow walked up the center aisle. He wore the dark, rigidly structured coat of an alpha king, the velvet collar turned up against the biting chill. His stride was measured and heavily practiced, carrying the calculated weight of a man acutely aware that every witness was currently assessing his political worth. Nellie remained absolutely still at the foot of the altar, the iron key of the estate pressing a familiar, freezing indentation into her bare palm. It was the ultimate physical anchor of her authority, a dense, unpolished piece of metal that granted access to the region's grain silos and winter armories. She held it with quiet reverence, feeling the jagged teeth bite into her skin as a reminder of the practical labor required to keep a territory alive. She watched Cassian approach, waiting for the customary meeting of eyes, the silent confirmation of the vows they were about to execute. It never came. Cassian's gaze slid past her, deliberate and evasive. His jaw tightened briefly as his eyes drifted toward the second row of the pews, locking onto the exact space where Vivian was seated. The shift was subtle enough that a less observant woman might have missed it entirely. But Nellie had spent her life studying the complex geometries of power and the unforgiving language of the court. She read the arrogant angle of his shoulders, the slight hesitation in his step, and the rigid set of his mouth. But it was not his wandering gaze that confirmed the true depth of the fracture. As Cassian reached the altar and rested his hands on the edge of the marble slab to steady himself, Nellie's eyes dropped instinctively to his left hand. There, resting starkly against the pale stone, was a fresh, dark smudge of galnut ink staining the side of his thumb. Certainty lodged in her chest like a splinter of ice. He was not simply distracted by her sister's calculated beauty. He had already formalized the betrayal on paper. The cold weight of the iron key of the estate grounded her against the sudden rush of clarity. Nellie did not gasp, her breath did not catch, and her hands did not tremble. She absorbed the concrete evidence written on his skin, letting the undeniable truth of his treason file itself away in her mind. The wet ink on his thumb was a louder declaration than any vow he could speak in this hall. She adjusted her grip on the heavy key, her silence, deepening into something impenetrable as she waited for his carefully orchestrated charade to reach its inevitable, documented conclusion. The disruption occurred just as the echo of the ritual chant settled into the freezing stone architecture. Cassian raised his right hand, his palm turned outward toward the assembly in an entirely performative gesture. It was the calculated, sweeping motion of a man who had spent weeks practicing in front of a mirror. Preparing to look burdened by the heavy mantle of leadership, the silence that followed was immediate, thick with the heavy scent of burning beeswax and the metallic tang of sudden tension. He did not look at Nellie. Instead, the ambitious Alpha King turned his chin slightly toward the elevated pews where the territorial delegates sat wrapped in thick winter furs, ensuring his profile caught the amber light spilling through the high-stained glass. He announced the halt. His voice was loud, projected with a deliberate resonance designed to echo off the vaulted ceilings and convey unyielding authority. He spoke of the harsh northern winters, the necessity of absolute fortitude, and the heavy demands of the regional lordship. He layered his betrayal in political necessity, wrapping his raw ambition in the noble language of duty, and then he dropped the word, insufficient. He declared the lineage of the woman before him insufficient for the high seat, citing the need for a stronger, more established bloodline to secure the borders against external threats. He formally rejected her claim to the Union, stating his intent to bind himself to a woman whose tactical alliances better served the Pack's survival. The reaction of the high-ranking guests was instantaneous, rippling through the grand hall like a sudden, freezing draft. Whispers broke out among the witness circles, a low hiss of scandalized breath and the aggressive rustling of heavy silk. Eyes darted toward the altar, waiting eagerly for the inevitable collapse. They expected a gasp, a sob, or the frantic pleading of a discarded Omega, realizing her entire social foundation had just been destroyed in front of the regional elites. Nellie gave them absolutely nothing. She stood before the cold marble altar in total, unyielding silence. Not a single muscle in her face twitched. She did not raise a trembling hand to her mouth. She did not sway on her feet. The ceremonial netting, pinned to her dark hair, remained perfectly motionless, the heavy metallic fibers hanging down her shoulders like a suit of armor rather than a delicate bridal shroud. She controlled her breathing with the clinical precision of a clockmaker, keeping her chest from rising too quickly, holding her posture so rigidly straight that it made the men sitting in the front rows shift uncomfortably in their seats. She recognized exactly what the man across from her was doing. He wanted a public spectacle. He wanted her to weep, to throw herself at his polished boots, to provide the emotional hysteria that would justify his cruelty and paint him as a tragic, pragmatic leader making a terrible sacrifice. Her silence starved him of that validation. Without her tears to anchor his grand performance, his declaration hung awkwardly in the freezing air, sounding less like a noble sacrifice and more like a simple, crude theft. He glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly when he met an expression completely void of the devastation he had anticipated. She merely watched him, her eyes calm and dark, recording his posture and his exact phrasing the way an archivist documents a severe structural flaw in a crumbling wall. The sharp click of a velvet-slippered heel against the flagstones shattered the uneasy quiet. From the front row of the family pews, Vivian stepped forward into the center aisle. She moved with a sweeping grace, her chin angled downward in an expression of carefully constructed sorrow. Every step was measured, designed to convey a false reluctance as she ascended the 3 marble stairs to join the man at the altar. She wore her gown of deep violet velvet, a color explicitly chosen to assert dominance over the pale, muted tones of the original bride, ensuring the contrast between them was visible to the furthest corners of the cathedral. Taking her place beside Cassian, the sister turned slightly, looking down at Nellie with a deeply manufactured pity. It was a look meant to consolidate her victory, a silent plea for the witnessing audience. To understand that she was merely stepping up to bear a burden, answering the call of duty for the good of the territory. Her lips parted in a soft, sympathetic sigh, though the corners of her mouth tightened with a suppressed, triumphant satisfaction. She had won. She had secured the regional lordship, outmaneuvered the quiet bookkeeper, and claimed the highest seat in the northern lands. All that remained was the ceremonial binding. Vivian reached out over the cold stone of the altar toward the ceremonial silver ribbons of the union, but as her hand extended, the heavy, unnatural stillness of the woman standing opposite her began to exert a strange physical pressure on the room. Nellie had still not looked away, nor had she offered a single word of protest. She simply tracked the movement of that manicured hand with a detached, clinical observation. Under the weight of that absolute composure, the illusion of the sisters' victory began to fracture. Vivian's fingers hovered over the silver ribbons, and then, distinctly, they trembled. The tremor traveled up her wrist, a tiny, involuntary spasm of nerves that she could not suppress. She tried to close her hand around the silk, but her knuckles whitened, betraying a sudden spike of panic. She could feel the eyes of the high-ranking guests shifting from Cassian's proud stance to her own shaking hand, and finally settling on the profoundly unnerving stillness of the woman they had just discarded. Not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole. Determined to reassert control, the Alpha King broke the mounting tension. Having secured his new political alliance with Vivian, Cassian required the final, physical surrender of the territory's authority to legitimize his abrupt pivot. He turned his body fully toward the woman he had just publicly discarded. He did not lower his voice to offer any private grace. Instead, he projected his demand into the vaulted ceiling, ensuring that every noble, elder, and witness in the high pews could hear the completion of her banishment. He extended his right hand, the heavy velvet of his ceremonial coat pulling taut across his shoulders. He demanded the immediate return of the iron key of the estate. It was a deliberate gesture designed to strip away her remaining dignity. He stood with his palm open, his chin raised in a posture of assumed victory, waiting for her to break. The high-ranking guests in the surrounding circles leaned forward in their carved wooden seats. They expected a plea. They expected sudden, desperate bargaining. She stood perfectly still under the crushing weight of their collective stare. The freezing draft slipping under the massive oak doors wrapped around her ankles, but she did not shiver. She focused entirely on the mechanical rhythm of her own breathing, letting the icy air fill her lungs and ground her in the physical reality of the stone floor. She looked at his outstretched hand. She did not see a former lover extending a final cruelty. She saw an ambitious administrator overplaying his hand. Slowly, she lowered her fingers to her waist. The iron key of the estate hung there, secured against her simple dress by a thick strap of boiled leather. It was not a decorative trinket. It was a massive, brutalist piece of rusted metal forged centuries ago. It unlocked the winter granaries, the sovereign tax ledgers, the fortified armory, and the deep subterranean archives where the original land tenure leases were kept in wax-sealed tubes. For 300 years, whoever carried this heavy iron dictated the survival of the entire Northern Territory. Her hands were entirely steady as she began to work the leather knot. She moved with an unhurried precision, refusing to fumble under the intense scrutiny of the cathedral. The crowd went utterly silent, watching the slow mechanics of her fingers. She slid the thick strap free of the buckle, letting the leather drop away. The heavy iron slipped loose and landed flat against her bare palm. It was freezing to the touch. Nellie slowly closed her fingers around the jagged teeth of the metal, letting the cold seep into her skin. She held it there. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. She allowed the dense, grounding weight of the iron to rest in her hand, anchoring her against the rising pressure in the room. Across the aisle, Cassian's fingers twitched in the open air. His jaw tightened. He assumed she was hesitating, clinging to the last pathetic remnant of her former status. He was entirely wrong. She was simply feeling the exact shape and mass of the burden she was about to relinquish forever. When she finally moved, she bypassed the Alpha King entirely. She did not cross the small distance between them to place the territorial authority into his waiting hand. Instead, she pivoted her shoulders by a fraction, orienting herself away from his performative stance and facing the massive, ancient marble block at the center of the cathedral. She took a step forward. The soft sole of her shoe made almost no noise against the floor, but the absolute control of her movement drew every eye in the great hall. She took another step, leaving Cassian standing with his hand extended to empty space. The subtle insult of ignoring a direct physical command from a high-ranking lord rippled through the front pews, but Nellie did not look back. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead on the central stone. Brandon Thorne stood rigid behind the carved marble block. As a pack elder whose entire life was governed by the strict, uncompromising boundaries of procedural law, he observed her trajectory with a sudden spike of anxiety. He still held the forgotten ceremonial union ribbons in his weathered hands, but his attention was entirely captured by the quiet woman approaching his station. He recognized the geometric shift in her path. She was not yielding to a man. She was addressing the foundational institution of the territory. By ancient northern custom, property handed directly from one person to another constituted a legal transfer of authority. Property placed upon the sacred altar constituted a formal surrender of the lease, back to the original sovereign grantor. Cassian did not know the administrative difference. The pack elder did. Nellie reached the edge of the smooth white stone. She did not rush. She raised her right hand, lifting the dark metal into the ambient light of the high clerestory windows. She positioned her fist precisely over the exact center of the ancestral marble and simply opened her fingers. The heavy iron dropped. The impact was a single, violent collision of dense metal against solid rock. The noise cracked like a whip through the freezing air. It echoed violently upward into the vast architectural heights of the cathedral, ricocheting off the heavy timber beams and plunging back down into the breathless congregation. The pack elders seated in the front rows physically flinched. Elder Thorn's shoulders jerked upward, his knuckles turning stark white around the silk ribbons. It was not the mere volume of the sound that struck them, but the absolute, crushing finality of it. It carried the heavy acoustic signature of a magistrate's wooden gavel slamming shut, or a vault door locking heavily from the outside. The iron key of the estate rested motionless on the white marble, dark and immovable against the pristine stone. The suffocating, terrifying stillness that rushed back into the cathedral was the realization that the legal foundation beneath their feet had been irrevocably fractured. As the heavy clack of cold iron against marble faded in the cavernous expanse of the cathedral, Nellie Vance did not step back from the altar. She did not lower her gaze, nor did she cross her arms to shield herself from the judging eyes pressing into her back. She simply remained anchored to the floorboards. Cassian Garrow stared at the physical symbol of the regional lordship she had surrendered. A smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He was waiting for the inevitable collapse, expecting her to weep or to beg for a lesser position within the estate he believed he now controlled. Nellie let him enjoy his delusion for a fraction of a second. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. When she finally spoke, her voice was neither loud nor trembling. It carried the dry, measured cadence of an inventory clerk cataloguing winter grain, steady, flat, and completely devoid of personal malice. "The iron key is yours, Cassian." The first sentence floated through the absolute quiet of the hall. Cassian's smirk widened slightly. Assuming the surrender was complete, he opened his mouth to offer a patronizing dismissal, but Nellie did not give him the space. Her dark eyes locked onto his, unblinking, holding him in place with the sheer force of her composure. "However, you will find that under Section 9 of the Founding Charter, the ancestral deed is strictly non-transferable to any secondary bloodline once the originally designated firstborn signee has been publicly rejected." The second sentence landed like a physical blow. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, jarring tension that tightened his jaw. A low, confused murmur began to ripple through the front pews. But Nellie's gaze did not waver. She watched the exact moment the political foundation of his ambition began to fracture. Therefore, by breaking this union pact at the altar, you have triggered an irreversible default of the land lease, and the entire Northern Territory now legally reverts in full to the sovereign crown. The third sentence sealed the trap. She delivered it with chilling administrative precision, offering no anger, no sorrow, and no invitation for debate. It was a mathematical certainty. Beside the marble altar, Brandon Thorn stood completely paralyzed. The pack elder had spent his life maneuvering territorial lineages, treating the region's legal foundations as his own flexible chessboard. But Nellie's precise invocation of Section 9 struck a nerve he had long thought buried in the dust of history. "It is a bluff," Cassian hissed, taking a sudden half-step forward, though he did not close the distance to Nellie. "It is a desperate lie. Elder Thorn, tell the hall she is lying." Elder Thorn did not answer. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably. He turned his back on the disgraced groom, his boots scraping clumsily against the polished stone floor as he rushed toward the heavy oak lectern near the apse. The Northern Charter of 842 rested there, housed within a velvet-lined wooden case. For generations, it had served as nothing more than a symbolic relic, ignored by men who assumed power by force rather than by law. Thorn fumbled desperately with the brass latches. The metal hinges let out a sharp squeal that echoed painfully across the cathedral. His gold-rimmed reading glasses slipped downward as he leaned heavily over the ancient text. He reached for the calfskin scroll, his ink-stained fingers slipping against the rigid edges before he managed to unroll the stiff, yellowed parchment. A scent of old dust and oxidized iron gall ink wafted into the stagnant air. Thorn's index finger, shaking violently, traced the faded, elaborate script. He bypassed the flowery preambles and dragged his nail down into the obscure, densely packed legal jargon of the 9th section. Nellie remained in her spot, watching his frantic movements with detached observation. She knew the rough texture of that specific parchment, having spent countless freezing nights in the keep's unheated annex, cross-referencing a copied manuscript. She knew the exact phrasing of the text. The unforgiving legal absolute that dictated the land belonged exclusively to the crown the moment a primary union was deliberately dishonored. Thorn stopped breathing. His trembling fingers froze against the parchment. Slowly, he raised his head. His glasses slipped further down his nose, exposing eyes that were wide and utterly horrified. He looked at Cassian, then stared at the iron key sitting uselessly on the marble, and finally his gaze shifted to Nellie. She stood waiting with the absolute stillness of a compass needle, finding north. The elder's mouth opened, attempting to form a reassurance, but all that emerged was a hollow, defeated rasp. The financial foundation of their pack had just evaporated. The rustle of the heavy calfskin was deafening in the cavernous space. Brandon Thorn traced his index finger down the center margin of the Northern Charter of 842. The elder's hand, usually steady when holding the sesamasium blade, trembled violently against the dry, cracking parchment. His eyes remained locked on the faded brown iron gall ink of Section 9. Thorn swallowed heavily. The sound echoed off the high, vaulted stone ceiling like a gavel striking wet wood. It is written here under the seal of the first sovereign that the lease of the northern estate is bound entirely to the union of the recognized firstborn bride of the Vance lineage. The elder's voice, normally a booming baritone meant to command absolute obedience, thinned into a hollow rasp. He adjusted his grip on the edges of the charter, the ancient material creaking under the pressure of his thumbs. Should the reigning heir reject this specific union, the lineage transfer is instantly rendered void. The territory, its borders, the timber rights, the grain stores, and the fortress itself. Thorn stopped reading. He finally lifted his head, his face entirely drained of color. "Finish the clause," Cassian said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, breathless void. He took a half-step forward, reaching blindly for a control that no longer existed. "The territory," Thorn whispered, the words carrying through the absolute, suffocating silence of the cathedral, "reverts entirely and permanently to the sovereign crown, effective immediately upon the verbal rejection of the bride. The current occupants forfeit all claims to taxation, military protection, and ancestral residence." The mockery that had saturated the hall only moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, total vacuum. Hundreds of high-ranking guests suddenly understood the gravity of the shift. They were standing on land that no longer belonged to their Alpha King. Vivian Sterling stood frozen on the dais, the ceremonial union ribbons still draped loosely over her wrists. Those ribbons were meant to bind her to the wealthiest estate in the Northern Territories. Instead, she was tethered to a man who had just publicly forfeited his entire inheritance, reducing them both to squatters residing in a royal fortress. Her perfect smile shattered, leaving behind a slack-jawed mask of horror. Cassian stared at the heavy calfskin document, his chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow bursts. He had expected begging. He had prepared to demonstrate his physical dominance by rejecting a weak mate before his peers. He had not prepared to be legally evicted by a 400-year-old administrative statute. The iron key of the estate, still resting on the marble altar, was no longer a symbol of his banishment of Nellie. It was the physical lock the crown had just placed on his entire future. Nellie Vance did not stay to watch the realization fully settle into Cassian's eyes. She had no interest in the frantic scrambling of men who suddenly found themselves stripped of their unearned power. The calculation was complete. The ledger was balanced. Reaching up to her shoulders, she grasped the edges of the oppressive silver-threaded veil. She pulled the pin from her hair. The cold metal slid out without a single sound. With a slow, fluid motion, Nellie let the shimmering fabric fall from her shoulders. It pooled onto the polished wooden surface of the nearest pew, collapsing into a heap of useless, expensive thread. It was no longer a symbol of an enduring alliance. It was simply a discarded shroud for a union she had systematically dismantled from the inside out. She turned her back on the altar, leaving the heavy iron key of the estate and the silver-threaded veil behind her. Not a single member of the pack moved to block her path. The same elites who had openly sneered at her mere moments ago now pressed themselves tightly against the cold stone columns, pulling their expensive coats and silk gowns out of her way as if she were a sudden, physical danger. The geometry of the room had entirely shifted. They looked at her not with the pity reserved for a discarded mate, but with the terrifying realization that she had been holding the knife the entire time, and they had willingly offered their throats. Nellie kept her posture perfectly straight. She did not rush toward the exit. Her low-heeled boots struck the marble floor in a steady, measured rhythm, a quiet metronome of departure that echoed against the vaulted walls. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. She focused her vision entirely on the heavy, iron-bound oak doors at the far end of the nave. She reached the grand entrance without a single hand reaching out to stop her. She gripped the cold iron handle, leaning her weight into the heavy wood, and pushed. The hinges groaned a deep, metallic protest, opening to reveal the stark, blinding grey light of the northern afternoon. Nellie stepped across the threshold, formally exiting the disputed territory, and pulled the great oak doors shut. The heavy iron latch fell into place behind her, with a definitive, echoing thud, cutting off the frantic shouts of the assembly and sealing Cassian inside the prison of his own arrogance. The immediate drop in temperature was absolute. Inside, the grand hall had been a suffocating chamber of body heat, heavy mirror incense, and the crushing weight of public scrutiny. Out here in the quiet, expansive freedom of the snow, the biting wind swept down from the jagged peaks, rushing across the stone courtyard and hitting the bare skin of her shoulders where the metallic lacework used to rest. She stopped on the top landing and inhaled deeply. The sharp, icy air burned its way down her throat, clearing the metallic tang of tension that had flooded the altar. A thin layer of sweat had gathered at the nape of her neck during the confrontation, born from the immense physical effort of maintaining her composure. Now, the freezing wind hit that dampness, turning it instantly to a line of frost against her skin. The sudden chill did not make her shiver. Instead, the sensation grounded her, providing a tactile confirmation of her autonomy. The suffocation was over. She began her descent down the wide granite staircase, her thin slippers finding purchase on the fresh dusting of snow. The world outside the cathedral was entirely white and grey, silent except for the low howl of the wind. She did not look back at the towering spires of the estate she had just legally dismantled. Her mind was already cataloguing the administrative fallout. The elders would spend hours combing through the archives, but she knew the founding document down to the shape of the faded ink strokes. She had spent countless nights in the lower library, tracing the lines of Section 9 by candlelight, memorizing the non-transferability clause, while Cassian concerned himself only with performative rank. The certainty that she had executed a flawless structural demolition was its own kind of warmth. There was no immediate destination, only the necessity of forward momentum. She walked past the stone gargoyles flanking the courtyard entrance, her posture perfectly straight. The gravel of the carriage path crunched rhythmically beneath her feet, every step acting as a physical severing of the expectations that had bound her since childhood. She noticed the carriage drivers huddled near the far stables, their breath plumbing in the freezing air. They saw only a solitary woman walking into the storm, unaware that the ground they stood on had just reverted entirely to the crown. The cold seeped through the thin fabric of her dress, biting into her joints, but she accepted the discomfort as the logical price of her exit. The winter was brutal, but it operated on rules of temperature and exposure, unlike the arbitrary loyalty of the court. At the bottom of the long stone path, near the wrought iron gates, a shadow detached itself from the line of waiting transport. The figure did not rush forward or call out. He simply stood beside the dark, polished wood of an Imperial carriage, waiting with the stillness of a compass needle finding north. Sovereign King Darius Vaughan wore a heavy charcoal greatcoat, the wide collar turned up against the driving wind, having watched the entire public debacle from the elevated alcoves of the cathedral. Nellie slowed her pace, her eyes scanning his posture. There was no aggression in his stance, no demand for submission, and no performative pity for a discarded bride. He occupied the freezing space, without the nervous impulse to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. As she approached the carriage steps, the monarch stepped forward. The snow compressed under his heavy leather boots, the sound distinct and measured. He did not offer a comforting arm to shield her from the wind, nor did he attempt to drape his coat over her shoulders in a display of possessive protection. Instead, Darius extended a gloved hand, holding a dry, leather-bound folder. The object was purely administrative. Nellie looked down at the offering, noting the thick stitching on the binding and the heavy brass clasp. A faint scent of old parchment, dry ink, and cedarwood wafted from the pages, cutting sharply through the ozone of the cold air. "The Imperial records of the northern boundaries," Darius said, his voice low, unhurried, and carrying easily over the wind. "They require a meticulous review. I am told the previous administration failed to maintain them." Nellie did not immediately reach for the folder, studying the worn leather instead to understand the absolute magnitude of the gesture. He was not offering a rescue from the cold. He was offering an entirely new position of authority. "They will search for a legal loophole that does not exist," Darius continued. His voice held the texture of rough linen, practical, unadorned, and entirely calm. "They will find nothing. The ancestral lease is irreparably broken." Nellie kept her gaze level with the silver clasp at his collar. "Section 9 leaves no room for interpretation. The clause is absolute. If the designated firstborn bride is publicly cast aside before the witness circle, the bloodline's claim to the soil is instantly voided. Alpha King Cassian assumed the charter was a ceremonial relic. He did not read the binding ink. Most ambitious men fail to read the fine print. The king tilted his head a fraction of an inch, his dark eyes registering the meticulous control in her breathing. "The crown possesses 50,000 soldiers. We have armed garrisons stretching from the frozen northern border to the southern seas. We do not lack swords." He paused, stepping slightly to the side to ensure the bitter wind did not blow the carriage door shut. "But we desperately lack minds capable of weaponizing a land deed with such flawless timing." Nellie allowed her knuckles to relax against the fabric of her skirt. The sheer, freezing air stung her cheeks, yet the presence of the sovereign offered a strange, anchored stability. He was not demanding her loyalty. He was stating an administrative fact. He did not offer her pity, because pity would have been an insult to the ruin she had just unleashed. "A blade can be parried," Nellie answered, her voice dropping into the pragmatic, measured cadence she used for auditing ledgers. "A signed charter cannot." "Exactly," Darius agreed quietly. "The high archives of the realm oversee every territorial registry, every bloodline contract, and every regional tax lease. The position of chief archivist has been vacant for 3 years because I refuse to give the keys to a sycophant." He gestured toward the open carriage door. The interior smelled faintly of melted beeswax, polished leather, and old paper. I am offering you the post. The Crown requires an intellect that views litigation as a sharper instrument than brute force. He did not step closer. He did not attempt to touch her shoulder or guide her by the elbow. He maintained a respectful, deliberate distance, offering the open door as a choice rather than a royal command. The lack of coercion settled in Nellie's chest like a stone dropping through still water, slow, thorough, filling every crack. The gravel of the courtyard crunched beneath the shifting hooves of the carriage horses, their breath pluming in the grey air. Nellie looked at the open door, then at the vast expanse of the northern sky. She did not look back toward the cathedral. The heavy iron key of the estate she had left on the marble altar was no longer her concern. Her former pack was already fading into a jurisdictional problem, a series of frozen assets and nullified land leases that she would soon control. "I will require a desk with adequate light," Nellie said simply. The faintest trace of approval shifted the corners of the sovereign's mouth. "You shall have the eastern wing of the Imperial Library. The morning sun strikes the reading tables directly." Nellie offered a single shallow nod. She reached out, grasping the cold iron handle of the carriage, and pulled herself up the steps. The transition from the biting winter wind to the insulated warmth of the velvet interior was immediate. A small brass footstove filled with glowing coals rested on the floorboards, radiating a dry heat that instantly began thawing her boots. The thick doors closed with a solid, echoing thud, sealing out the noise of the shouting estate behind them. As the carriage lurched forward, its iron-rimmed wheels rolling heavily over the frost-hardened road, Darius took his seat on the opposite bench. He did not attempt to engage her in further conversation about the public mockery she had just endured. Instead, he reached into the compartment beside him and produced a thick, worn leather satchel. He unbuckled the brass straps and placed a stack of preliminary regional reports onto the empty space on the velvet cushion beside her. "The current state of the Western Grain registries," Darius noted, his gaze directed out the window at the passing snow-laden pines. "They are an administrative mess." Nellie looked down at the documents. The pages were cut from heavy calfskin parchment, bound with frayed cord and marked with disorganized, fading ink. For the first time, since she had stood at the altar, watching the silver ribbons fall over Vivienne Sterling's wrists, the rigid tension locking her shoulders began to ease. She reached out. Her fingers, still pale from the outdoor chill, brushed the rough edge of the top ledger. The tactile friction of the dry paper grounded her in a way nothing else could. Without a word, she untied the binding cord. Her hands were perfectly steady. She began to sort the loose pages, separating the tax columns from the territorial boundary disputes with practiced efficiency. She noticed a mathematical inconsistency on the very first page, a miscalculation in the winter wheat yield that would have cost the Crown thousands of silver coins. "I will need a charcoal pencil," she murmured, not looking up from the numbers. Darius silently withdrew a slender pencil from his coat and placed it on the velvet cushion beside her hand. The carriage swayed gently as it cleared the outer stone gates of the territory, carrying them steadily toward the capital. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the rhythmic turning of paper and the quiet scratching of charcoal, as Nellie categorized her first official Imperial files. The smell of dry ink and sealing wax replaced the oppressive scent of the cathedral's incense. She aligned the edges of the documents, smoothing the creases with the pad of her thumb. She was no longer a discarded bride, invisible and overlooked in the shadow of an ambitious Alpha King. She was the chief archivist of the realm, and she had vital work to do. Days later, the iron-bound doors of the Imperial Office of Lands closed behind Nellie with a decisive thud, sealing as the freezing winter out in the streets of the capital. The immediate shift in atmosphere was absolute. The air inside the vast repository did not carry the damp, biting chill of the northern provinces or the cloying perfume of a wedding procession. Instead, it smelled of dry parchment, aged calfskin bindings, melting beeswax, and the sharp tang of pine oil. Vaulted ceilings arched high above, while narrow windows allowed geometric pillars of grey afternoon light to cut through the shadows. Towering oak shelves stretched endlessly into the gloom, heavy with centuries of weight. Nellie walked slowly down the central corridor, the soft tap of her boots absorbed by thick woven runners. There was no one here to demand her attention, no impatient nobleman expecting her to pour his wine. She extended her hand, trailing bare fingertips along the polished edge of the nearest bookshelf. The wood was remarkably smooth, worn down by generations of careful archivists. A fine layer of dry, clean dust gathered against her skin. She stopped to rub the particles between her thumb and index finger. It was not the gritty ash of the northern hearths. It was the quiet, undisturbed residue of recorded history. For the first time since the morning of the solstice, the tight knot of hypervigilance in her chest began to loosen. Here, her meticulous nature was not an annoying habit to be tolerated by an ambitious fiancé. It was the exact currency this fortress required. Silence was a kind of armor here, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. It did not swallow her voice. It provided the space for her mind to expand, settling around her shoulders with the familiar weight of a well-worn cloak. At the far end of the primary gallery sat a massive desk carved from dark, unvarnished timber. It was bare, save for a neat stack of registry forms, a brass inkwell, and one object of monumental consequence. The mahogany stamp of the realm rested exactly in the center of the leather blotter. Nellie approached the desk, but did not sit immediately. She stood over the seal, observing the heavy brass base and the intricately turned wooden handle. Traces of old red wax clung stubbornly to the deepest grooves of the royal crest. This inanimate object held the legal authority to freeze territorial assets, revoke century-old leases, and dismantle a corrupt Pax infrastructure without a single drop of blood. It was the physical manifestation of the sovereign's will. Nellie placed her palm lightly over the rounded top of the handle, feeling its solid, unyielding weight. The northern lords believed that power was a loud performance meant to intimidate the weak. Standing in the quiet sanctuary of the Imperial office, she finally understood how fragile that kind of power truly was. The quiet contemplation was broken by the soft scrape of a side door opening. 3 individuals entered the gallery, their movements synchronized to the hushed rhythm of the repository. They wore the muted grey wool tunics of the administrative staff, their hands stained with ink, their expressions carrying the calm professionalism of those who dealt in facts rather than politics. The eldest of them, a tall woman with silver hair, pulled into a tight knot, stepped forward and offered a brief, respectful incline of her head. There was no demand for Nellie to prove her bloodline, no sneering appraisal of her lack of formal finery. They simply looked at her hands, noted the absence of nervous tremors, and recognized a fellow keeper of records. Without the need for introductions, the staff efficiently distributed the afternoon's workload. A heavy iron cart was wheeled to the side of Nellie's desk, groaning under the weight of several lockboxes. These contained the disputed northern land deeds, the very foundation of the territorial crisis she had triggered. She took her seat in the high-backed leather chair, the stiff material creaking softly. Adjusting her sleeves, she uncapped the brass inkwell and drew a fresh piece of parchment toward her. The first box was unlocked with a sharp click. Inside lay a chaotic jumble of property transfers, tax receipts, and inheritance claims that the Garrows had allowed to fall into disrepair over the decades. Nellie began the painstaking process of extracting the documents one by one. She deliberately organized the files chronologically, her eyes scanning the faded ink for discrepancies. The physical act of sorting grounded her further. There was a resonant satisfaction in the heavy sound of the parchment sliding into its proper place on the desk. the friction of stiff paper against wood acting as a steady metronome for her thoughts. Midway through the stack, her fingers brushed against a thick cylinder of protective leather. She untied the waxed cord and unrolled the document across her desk. The collaborative silence of the room was absolute. They were dissecting the financial and territorial validity of the Garrow estate, reducing Cassian's grand political ambitions to a series of invalid contract dates and voided clauses. Nellie reached for the mahogany stamp of the realm, bringing it closer to the aligned stack of reviewed documents. She was no longer a discarded woman standing in the shadow of a cathedral. She was the architect of their ruin, building a fortress of undeniable evidence, one chronological file at a time. Later that afternoon, the scent of roasted tea leaves and drying ink filled the upper study of the Imperial Office of Lands. Nellie sat at the long oak table, her posture perfectly aligned with the straight edge of the drafting board. The light filtering through the high-arched windows was the color of bruised iron, casting long, grey shadows across the stacked territorial registries. The heavy door opened without a creak. Darius stepped into the room, bringing with him the faint smell of winter ozone and cold cedar. He did not speak immediately. Instead, the Sovereign King crossed the floor with measured, unhurried steps and placed a thick stack of folded vellum on the desk before her. Nellie did not rush. She carefully wiped the tip of her quill on a linen cloth, set the feather down, and broke the royal wax seal on the first document. It was a formal default report. The neat, administrative columns detailed the complete financial collapse of the regional lordship. When she had invoked the Northern Charter of 842 at the altar, she had triggered a cascade of legal mechanisms that Cassian had been too arrogant to study. Without the valid, sovereign-backed land lease, the neighboring pacts had immediately voided their trade agreements. The winter grain shipments were permanently halted at the border. The territorial tax collectors had already been recalled to the capital. His alliances dissolved by morning, Darius noted, setting one cup of tea near her elbow. He took the chair opposite hers, his broad shoulders relaxing against the carved wood. Vivienne's family withdrew their financial support. The moment the deed reverted to the crown, they were buying a sovereign lordship, not an empty stone manor. She turned the page, tracing the ink with her eyes. The numbers were absolute. The estate was completely bankrupt, its assets frozen under the strict jurisdiction of the realm. The man who had humiliated her before the entire pack was now legally destitute, stripped of his authority not by a sword, but by a clause buried in calfskin parchment. The certainty lodged in her chest like a compass needle finding north. Nellie picked up the teacup, letting the heat seep into her ink-stained fingers. She met the king's gaze over the rim. There was no boastful grin on her face, no dramatic exclamation of victory. There was only the quiet, grounded satisfaction of an equation solving itself perfectly. Darius raised his own cup in a silent, professional salute. They drank the bitter tea together, enveloped in the shared, unshakable triumph of structural justice. 3 floors below the serene quiet of the upper study, the grand vestibule of the archive building shattered under the weight of frantic noise. The heavy double doors of the entryway shuddered violently as a man threw his entire physical weight against the wood. Cassian Garrow stumbled into the stone foyer, bringing a sudden, chaotic draught of freezing rain and wet wool into the meticulously ordered hall. He was entirely unrecognizable from the pristine, velvet-draped Alpha King who had stood at the altar weeks ago. His riding coat was torn at the hem, splattered with frozen mud from a desperate, non-stop ride to the capital. The intricate silver embroidery on his collar was grey with road dust. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot and hollowed out by the relentless, exhausting stress of sudden bureaucratic ruin. He had not slept in days. The realization of his absolute bankruptcy had driven him across the territory like a hunted animal. "I need to see her," he demanded, his voice cracking loudly against the vaulted ceiling, The sound was harsh, undisciplined, and entirely out of place in a building dedicated to quiet procedure. He took a stumbling step toward the grand marble staircase that led to the upper administrative levels. Nellie Vance, tell her I am here. Tell her she must sign the waiver. He did not make it past the second step. 4 of the king's personal royal guards shifted seamlessly into his path, moving with synchronized precision. They did not draw their weapons. They did not need to. The men simply closed the gap, forming an immovable wall of dark iron armor and stoic discipline. Cassian hit the line of guards and bounced back, his boots slipping on the polished marble floor. He caught himself against the brass railing, his breath coming in ragged, desperate heaves. The physical deterioration of his body was matched only by the collapse of his entitlement. The captain of the guard looked down at him with the cold, detached expression of a man reading a misfiled ledger. He did not raise his voice or issue a threat. He merely adjusted his gauntlet and stepped forward, attempting to force the intruder to retreat. But the state could not reason with frantic men. Driven by sheer panic, Cassian ducked past the armored shoulder, sprinting past the vestibule checkpoints and bursting toward the inner sanctums before the alarm could even be fully raised. Deep within the building, the outer halls of the high archives of the realm smelled consistently of binding glue, beeswax, and dry vellum. Nellie preferred this quiet perimeter for reviewing incoming territorial manifests, standing at a long oak reading table where the northern light angled sharply through the high clerestory windows. The silence of the room was a structured, heavy thing, built upon centuries of recorded history and undisputed law. That quiet discipline shattered when the secondary brass doors were forced open with a violent shudder. Cassian Garrow stumbled into the antechamber, the royal guards hot on his heels. He looked nothing like the immaculate man who had stood at the altar. The gold-threaded lapels of his coat were rumpled, his breathing was jagged, and the winter wind had lashed his face into a raw, feverish color. His heavy riding boots left wet, muddy tracks across the polished flagstones, a jarring physical violation of the pristine administrative process. He had managed to break the perimeter, driven by the sheer frantic momentum of a man watching his entire political existence dissolve. Spotting Nellie by the reading table, he closed the distance between them in a few desperate strides, slapping a thick sheaf of folded parchment down onto the oak surface. The forceful impact sent a faint cloud of dust swirling into the slanted beams of sunlight. "Nellie," Cassian rasped, his voice cracking under the strain of exhaustion and travel. "Nellie, please, you have to sign this." She did not flinch. She did not take a step backward to create distance. Nellie simply kept her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her posture perfectly aligned. She let her gaze drop to the document he had slammed before her. It was a retroactive legal waiver drawn up on cheap regional parchment. The ink was heavily smeared at the margins, betraying the trembling hand of whoever had drafted it in such a reckless hurry. "You have to sign it," Cassian repeated, his tone shifting into a breathless, pleading cadence that sounded entirely foreign coming from his throat. "I know you are angry. I know what I did was cruel, but we grew up together. You know how hard I worked for the Northern Estate. You cannot just take it away over a technicality. If you sign this waiver, it restores the lease. We can fix this. I can make this right." He was trying to appeal to a shared history that had died the moment he draped the union ribbons over Vivienne's wrists. He expected tears, or perhaps rage, or a bitter argument about his betrayal. He expected her to engage with his emotional collapse, to validate his panic with her own residual pain. Instead, Nellie reached out and calmly pulled the parchment toward her. She scanned the hastily written text, her expression remaining as flat and unreadable as a closed ledger. The frantic energy the disgraced lord was projecting seemed to break against her quietness like water hitting a stone wall. After a long, measured silence, Nellie lightly tapped her index finger against the third paragraph. "Section 4. Subclause 2, she said, her voice dry, precise, and devoid of any residual affection. You used the word waive instead of remit. Under sovereign law, a waived territorial claim does not return to the previous leaseholder. It defaults permanently to the Crown. Cassian stared at her, his mouth falling open as the oxygen seemed to completely leave his lungs. Furthermore, Nellie continued, sliding the document back across the table with a smooth, dismissive push. Your scribe misaligned the temporal dates. You have not drafted a restoration of your estate, Cassian. You have legally drafted a voluntary, permanent forfeiture. I suggest you hire a better clerk before you attempt to navigate royal litigation again. The stark, administrative correction hit him harder than a physical blow. The emotional narrative he had desperately constructed, the tragic misunderstanding, the plea for forgiveness, the shared nostalgic past, evaporated instantly. Nellie had not just rejected his apology, she had treated his frantic, life-or-death legal maneuver with the detached mildness of a professional editor correcting a novice's grammar. A flush of dark, mottled red crawled up Cassian's neck. The tendons in his jaw tightened as the realization that she was entirely immune to his presence broke whatever remained of his polished restraint. You think you can just dismiss me? Cassian snarled, dropping the pretense of the pleading ex-fiancée. His voice echoed harshly against the high-vaulted ceilings of the archive, a raw sound of cornered ambition. He stepped forward, leaning his weight heavily over the oak table, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. You are coming back to the Northern Territory. You are going to fix this right now. He never made contact. Before his fingers could even brush the sleeve of her dark linen dress, a shadow detached itself from the perimeter of the room. The king's personal royal guards, acting on a single, silent gesture from Sovereign King Darius Vaughan, who stood observing from the inner archway, moved with absolute discipline. There were no shouted warnings. There was no chaotic scramble. There was only the heavy, rhythmic clank of polished steel and thick leather boots as 3 massive men stepped directly into his path. They did not draw their swords. They did not need to. The guards simply formed an unbroken physical wall of armor between the reading table and the desperate man. The sudden shift in the room's geometry was absolute. Cassian slammed into the chestplate of the lead guard and bounced back, stumbling awkwardly over his own heels. The armored sentinel did not even shift his stance. He merely looked down through the narrow slit of his visor, his posture radiating the immovable, institutional weight of the sovereign's authority. Step back from the chief archivist, the guard stated. The command was delivered in a low, flat monotone, entirely devoid of anger or exertion, which only emphasized its absolute authority. Nellie remained perfectly still behind the protective barrier of the king's personal royal guards. She did not shrink back, nor did she offer a triumphant smirk. She simply watched him with the quiet, observant eyes of a woman who no longer needed to manage his temper to survive. The physical space between them was no longer just a matter of distance. It was a permanent, impenetrable legal boundary. His shoulders finally slumped, his frantic energy bleeding out onto the cold stone floor as he took a slow, defeated step backward. Just then, the heavy oak door at the far end of the archive room clicked shut. The slow, deliberate sound of its iron latch carried enough weight to drain the remaining oxygen from the corridor. Cassian froze entirely. His breathing hitched as the ambient noise evaporated. Footsteps sounded against the polished slate floor. They were unhurried. The cadence belonged to a man who never needed to run toward power, because it already resided in his bones. Darius Vaughan stepped into the light of the clerestory windows. He wore a simple coat of midnight wool, devoid of the performative gold braiding Cassian favored. The Sovereign King did not issue a command to his royal guards. He merely walked past the faltering nobleman, as if Cassian were nothing more than a draught of unpleasant winter air. Nellie kept her hands folded over the open ledger. Her spine remained perfectly straight. She watched the monarch circle her workspace, the clean scent of cedar and cold ozone trailing in his wake. Darius stopped directly behind her chair. He did not crowd her shoulders or pull her into his chest. Instead, he reached out and rested his bare palm flat against the corner of the oak desk. It was a gesture devoid of possessiveness, yet absolute in its authority. That single hand on the wood established a legal and physical frontier that no man in the realm could cross. "Your Majesty," Cassian managed to say, his voice thinning into a reedy scrape. His knuckles turned white where he gripped his coat. "This is a misunderstanding. The succession of the Northern Territory requires only a minor addendum." A signature from the archivist. Darius looked down at the parchment resting under Nellie's ink-stained fingers. The Northern Charter of 842 lay unrolled, its ancient calfskin edges weighed down by brass cylinders. The king's expression remained as unreadable as glacial ice. "The law does not misunderstand, Lord Garrow," Darius said. His voice was low, occupying the silence the way other men occupied speech. Without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. It only records the truth. Cassian took a half step forward. "She is my former intended. She is purposefully delaying the transfer out of spite. If you would just allow me to explain the tribal precedent." "You are standing in a sovereign archive," Darius interrupted. His tone barely rose above a murmur, yet it struck the stone walls with the force of a falling gavel. "You are speaking to the chief archivist of the realm. You will address her by her proper title, or you will not address her at all." The silence that followed swallowed the ruined man whole. Cassian stared at the king, then looked at Nellie. He no longer saw a quiet placeholder. He saw an impenetrable wall of authority. Nellie did not offer him a sympathetic glance. She merely dipped her quill into the inkwell, the scratching of the metal nib sounding like the slow sharpening of a blade. The royal guards stepped forward. Cassian's jaw worked silently. He looked at the ancient charter, then at the steady gaze of the woman he had discarded. The political empire he had tried to build on the foundation of her humiliation had been dismantled by her silence. Shoulders slumping under the weight of his ruined inheritance, he allowed the guards to escort him down the corridor. Nellie did not watch him leave. She waited until the heavy oak doors shut, sealing out the frantic energy of her past. Dust motes drifted lazily through the shafts of pale winter sunlight. The ambient temperature of the room seemed to rise, the cold tension melting into the familiar scent of dry parchment and beeswax candles. Darius lifted his hand from the desk. He stepped back, deliberately giving her the physical space to breathe. "The registry is fully updated," Nellie said, her voice steady. She moved the founding charter aside, revealing a crisp sheet of heavy vellum beneath it. "The asset freeze on the Garrow estate is documented. The reversion of the land lease is legally binding. And the final deed?" Darius asked, his gaze settling on the new document. She pulled the vellum closer. It was a formal grant of independence, detailing her permanent authority over the archives and her direct jurisdiction under the crown. No pack elder could challenge it. No ambitious nobleman could ever use her bloodline as a stepping stone again. Nellie reached toward the carved wooden box at the edge of her workspace. She retrieved the mahogany stamp of the realm. The wood was smooth against her palm, a tactile manifestation of the sovereign power she had earned. She pressed the brass matrix into the scarlet ink pad. She aligned the stamp over the bottom right corner of the vellum. She did not hesitate. The heavy thud of the mahogany stamp of the realm echoed against the stone walls, a sharp strike that finalized the document. Nellie lifted the wood, leaving behind a flawless crimson crest. Darius looked at the bright red seal, a faint warmth softening the sharp angles of his face. He understood the exact price of what she had just secured. "It is recorded," the king stated quietly. "It is," Nellie agreed. She set the stamp aside and leaned back in her chair. Outside the arched windows, the bitter northern wind whipped through the courtyard, carrying the threat of endless snow. But inside the archive, The air was warm. A fire crackled softly in the massive stone hearth, casting a golden glow over the rows of ledgers. Nellie looked at the drying ink, then up at the sovereign, who had offered her a desk instead of a cage. The cold linen of the cathedral and the long walk into exile belonged to another lifetime. She had built her own sanctuary out of paper and law, and no one would ever tell her she did not belong in it again.